Alright, so it's 10 o'clock. There's two other people here. Hi, Julia. I'm not sure who Pepto Bismol is. You can always respond in chat if you feel like it. But I'll go ahead and start the lecture and we'll see if anybody watches it. So, alright, so social psychology is a pretty cool topic. And do let me know if I'm not coming through clear through the chat or something like that. Hopefully it's going well. I didn't watch the other video to see if my volume was okay, but we'll see. So social psychology, I teach this right now in the spring semester for a whole course. So it's 205 social psychology. Unfortunately, due to the coronavirus, we aren't doing our discussions, but before we went remote teaching, the class consisted of mainly just talking about a lot of stuff and having a lot of in-class discussion with the presentation and stuff. So this topic tends to go pretty long. There's a lot of stuff that we cover, and it's a rising field in psychology because everything's becoming more involved and reactionary. So let's go ahead and get started and start talking about the topic. Right, so it's a study of how we feel, think about, and behave with others around us. The idea that when there are people around us, I'm always looking to the left because I have two screens and the screen is where my presentation is. So maybe I should try to put it this way, right in front. All right, so yeah, okay, that works out better. So yeah, it's the idea that wherever we are, we have a social influence. We influence other people, and other people have influence on us. So some definition terms, you have the social situation. So this is who we are interacting with. And they don't usually have to be physically there. For example, we are doing this over the internet, but in your mind, you have a social presence. It's the idea that someone's always judging you or having some type of influence. If you may think to yourself like, what would my parents think or what would my friends think? Those are all considered part of social psychology. So we know that we have a lot of attitudes about tons of stuff. Our president has tons of attitudes about things. Yeah, that has caused issues in today's society. So fun stuff, right? Social norms are what we know we should do in a given situation. So that's being turned on, its head right now. The whole idea of social norms, what you should do, how you should interact with people, a lot of habits, right? Like shaking hands. We try not to do that anymore. So you can see a lot of people like, oh, about to shake hands, and then like, wait a minute, don't do that. And just proximity things. Saying hi to your neighbors is really awkward when you like have to stay 6 feet away from them, kind of thing. So we're living in an age where the social norms that we take for granted is really being like challenged right now. Where you can go and all that cool stuff. So we'll be talking a lot about stuff that's relevant. So let's see. I seem to not be in the right thing. Okay. All right. So social cognition is this knowledge. So not all of us have the same social cognition, this awareness of people around us. Some of us were more oblivious than others. So social cognition is this idea that we are aware to a certain spectrum, higher and lower, on these issues. In social cognition, for example, if you have people that have autism, they kind of suffer with social cognition. They could be really intelligent in other ways, but the social deficit is there. So we explore how people select, interpret, remember, and use social information. We talk about things like how you perceive other people. We'll talk about attribution, which basically is that basically what causes do you attribute to people's actions. So we'll talk more about that. The self as a social object, so we are aware of ourselves, or at least to some extent. This varies from person to person, but we are aware of how we present ourselves to other people. So that can be an influence, and talking about that, you can see I have not cut my hair because it doesn't matter. I'm not going anywhere, so that's how it is. Sorry, I'm just messing with the links, pictures. Yeah, and I would ask this broadly to the class, so take a moment to think about it. are you generally aware of your social situations? So how often do you kind of take time to think about, hey, what am I doing, or other people judging you, or is it just on rare occasions? Some of us try to not think about our social situations as much. Sometimes we zone out when we're working or something like that to not think of ourselves. And sometimes we do, like maybe when you're eating in the fishbowl in Mawini, when we used to do things like that. You may be all of a sudden really aware of people like looking at you through the glasses or something like that. So attribution is what we think about why people behave in a certain way. So we have a breakdown of whether it's internal or external, whether the cause is because they wanted to do it, or is it because of the environment. We talk about stable versus unstable causes. This is a persistent thing, and whether the person actually has control over their behavior. So we kind of have two broad categories. We have a situational attribution, when we decide that the behavior was caused by some aspect of the environment. So something in the environment caused them to act in a certain way. If someone trips and falls, do you say, well, the environment caused it, the ground was wet, or there was snow on the ground? Or do we say it's a dispositional attribution, when we think the behavior is just how they are, like a personality attribution? So if someone trips and falls and you say, oh, that person's always clumsy, that would be a dispositional attribution. So the fundamental attribution error is that we tend to basically think that when other people do something, like when they trip and fall, we think they're clumsy. When we trip and fall, we think it's environmental. So we say, oh, I don't normally fall down, but this just happens to be, I'm clumsy. So if you see someone outside in the cold, like snow, and they have they're not dressed that warm, then you may say, oh, that person just likes to be cold, or they can tolerate the cold. And when you're outside and you're not dressed as warm, you may say, oh, this is that one time I forgot my coat, or I didn't expect the weather to be bad. So the actor-observer effect basically explains this, the tendency for us to make situational. Oh, sorry, I got those confused. The actor-observer effect is what I just explained. The fundamental attribution error is when we tend to overestimate the internal traits. So our brains are very, lazy. So when we see other people do a certain behavior, it makes more sense for us to judge that's part of their character. So the fundamental attribution error would say when someone cuts you off while you're driving, they are a bad driver. So you're just like, oh, they're a bad driver. That is overestimating their internal traits and underestimating what part of the environment might have caused that. Maybe they were in a rush, or maybe they saw something in the road and they had to move out of the way. So maybe it's this one-time thing where they cut you off and they didn't really mean it, right? When I started driving, when I barely started driving as a teenager, I had a hard time just paying attention to everything. So sometimes I didn't see the car there and I've cut people off by accident. That involves a lot of road rage because California people are just mad all the time. I don't know. But the driver drove up next to me and was all raging at me. And I was like, oh, man, I didn't even see you there. And I just got my license like a week ago. So that would be a situational attribution. I didn't really see him, versus a dispositional attribution. I'm a bad driver and I cut him off on purpose or something like that. So the takeaway message is for you to slow down when judging other people's actions, because when you think of them as a bad driver, or if they did it intentionally, a dispositional judgment, you tend to be more upset about it because you feel like it's a personal attack. If you assume it's a situation attribution, like an environmental cause, you become less upset because you're not thinking it's your fault. Maybe it's just something about it, right? Maybe they're really in a rush, or maybe they're intoxicated, or I don't know, something like that. They didn't see you, then you don't get mad at them. But if you think they cut you off intentionally, then you do. Or if they bump into you intentionally, then you get upset. So more on that. Text messages was this. Okay. So the actor is the person who's doing the behavior, and the observer is the person watching the behavior. So these three principles affect what kind of attributions you make. So consistency, does the person perform this action regularly? If it's not consistent, so if you know the person and this is not how they normally behave, then it's a situation attribution. So if your friend is calm all the time and one time they rage out, you would say, oh, it's a situation attribution. But if your friend who has a hot temper and they rage out, you more say it's a disposition attribution because the consistency is high. They always do it. Consensus, do most people perform this action? Is everyone at that situation doing the same thing? So at a party, people are like super excited, I don't know, doing wild things. We may say it's high in consensus. So we say the person's behavior may be part of the party scene. Like when you're at the party, you're screaming, I don't know, yelling and stuff like that, dancing wildly, whatever you do at parties. We would say it's a situation attribution. If you were to do the same things you do at a party at something else, like, I don't know, the coffee shop, then it may be have very, very low consensus, and people may do a dispositional attribution, like you just like to dance in public. Distinctiveness, does the person perform similar actions? So are there other actions that help you to decide if this is part of the environment or not? So if it's very distinct, the person stands out, and they do other things in that situation, then you may more likely to say it's situational. So again, with the whole intoxication thing, like if you're not just dancing wildly, but talking loudly, screaming, all those things relate to each other, and we may say, oh, that person's just kind of intoxicated, or I don't know, other things. But if the distinctiveness is very low, there was just this kind of one weird thing, then we might more likely to make a disposition attribution. We usually skip that. We have a personal identity wheel that I hand out so to talk about these different things, but we have an idea of our self-esteem. So the personal identity wheel has this part where it asks you about 3 traits of yourselves, and most of us tend to put at least 2 positive traits, and very rarely we put negative traits. So most people will ask you 3 traits I described you, you're going to give me 3 positive ones. So that tells us our self-esteem is more positive than it is negative. Sometimes I get like 2 negative traits. Rarely do I get like 3 negative traits. So that might be indicative of a lower self-esteem. This leads us to this idea of positive illusions, that we just tend to think of ourselves better than we are. And that's really good for our self-esteem, because if you're always kind of being realistic about yourself, you may not be as happy. So we like to forget about the bad things about ourselves. The self-serving bias is the tendency to take credit for our successes and deny responsibility for our failures. So basically, if I pass the exam, it's because I'm smart. And if I fail the exam, it's because of whatever other issues, right? It could be anybody. It could be the bad roommate. It could be the test is bad. It could be the professor's bad. The class is bad. The online format. All that stuff. You'll blame it on anything but yourself. So self-serving bias. We talked about stereotype threat in the intelligence chapter. You know, the idea that you may self-fulfill a negative stereotype about yourself. Especially if you're made aware of it in a given social situation. Social comparison is when we compare ourselves to other people. So if we do a upward comparison, that means when we compare ourselves to people that are better than us, that tends to make us feel bad. Sometimes it helps us to motivate ourselves. So you compare yourself to, I don't know, someone who's fit and athletic, so that you motivate yourself to also become fit and athletic. You can compare yourself to rich people, I mean Bill Gates or something like that. That might kind of make you sad. I don't know, if there was this thing about like if Bill Gates drops $100 bill, he doesn't even pick it up because, you know, it costs him more money to pick it up than him do nothing. So I think that's kind of an exaggeration. But the circumstances of wealth is different, right? So we can socially compare ourselves to, I don't know, celebrities who have to self-quarantine right now, right? Their self-quarantine is probably a little different from everyone else's self-quarantine because they have all the luxuries that you can think of. So downward social comparison is when you compare yourself to someone worse off than you. So that tends to make you feel better because there's always someone worse off than you. You can always figure out somebody that's worse off, right? Whatever your situation is. Although that's hidden in like a bottom line right now. Our unemployment rate is so high, but at least you're not homeless yet. Yeah, right? Unless you are, then you're like, oh, at least I have this or that. until you're that last person, I don't know, that crazy person who's naked on the street running around, trying to bite people's face off. Then that might be the bottom of the barrel there, and you can't compare yourself to someone worse off than that. Or you can say, at least I'm not dead. That could be something to, downward compare yourself to. All right. Cool. Our viewer counts have gone up, so we have 8 people watching now. Person perception is what we basically judge other people on. So we usually judge people on their faces as well as this, overall body image, style, and stuff like that. We have we're shallow. So we like people who look good. So beautiful is good is a stereotype, even a generalization. So basically, good-looking people have good traits. They are successful. They're charismatic. We just have these positive traits around people who look better, right? It's the same thing you could say, like, ugly people are bad, kind of, as a stereotype, right? Because we have this in Disney even. The main character is always good looking, and the evil character is always like hags and things like that, scary looking stuff, right? Unless you guys watch the new Maleficent and all that, and how that is a cool flip of the stereotype. But anyways, beautiful is good. The reason why this could happen is what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. Is how you act towards them can cause them to act in certain ways. So if you say a beautiful person is charismatic, you may talk to them more. You may expect them to be able to hold a conversation more, and then you feel like, oh, that person was really talkative. They had fun things to talk about, but it might have been you leading them on and giving them the topics. If you think they're trustworthy, for example, they may become trustworthy because you trust them. So they have to follow up with your expectations. So there's that kind of awareness that it plays itself out. Same thing with if you turn it to, ugly is bad, right? So if you think someone who looks, mean or something like that, and so you don't talk to them, you ignore them, or you don't look their way, then that may self-fulfill itself, right? So that grumpy neighbor that always looks angry, and you're like, oh man, I'm scared of him, I don't want to interact with them, that can lead them to think worse. Every time they see you, they just see you kind of like run away from them, then they get mad at you, and it kind of self-fulfills that, you never get to know people kind of thing. So, the skin deep stereotype. The just word hypothesis is the belief that people get the outcomes that they deserve. This is a really good discussion topic, the just word hypothesis, because it's very relevant now, right? So when the just word hypothesis is the idea that people get what they deserve. I usually use the example that if you get robbed at night, right? You can say, well, you shouldn't be out at that time of night, or you shouldn't have been walking in that neighborhood, or you should have been more aware of your environment. All those are kind of explanations we give so that we don't think about that could happen to you. That crime is a random element of just the world, that crime can happen to anybody. We give ourselves excuses so that crime doesn't happen to us, like, oh, my house never gets burglarized because I locked the door, or I won't get into a crime situation because I'm not out after 10 o'clock at night, or I live in a nice neighborhood, and so forth. Now, the new explanation is, let's talk about the coronavirus, right? So when this was happening to China, people were saying like, well, they deserve it. The Chinese kind of deserve the virus because they were eating animals at the wet markets and stuff. So the whole world was like, oh, look, it's China's problem. They're like backwards and they're eating wild animals, and that's why they got this virus, and it's really their fault. And that allows us to really think that we're safe, that it's China's problem, right? The just word hypothesis says it's China's problem, so they got to deal with it. But now it's pretty much like everywhere, right? So we can't really use that argument anymore. It's China's problem. But we can still use the argument that I'm not going to get the coronavirus because I'm not one of those people who are just everywhere interacting with tons of other people, kind of stuff like that, not social distancing. So maybe the people who get the coronavirus is that due to their, like the spring breakers, right? When I asked my students, like, who do you think gets the coronavirus, a lot of them said, oh, it's the spring breakers, the teenagers who think they're not going to get the virus and stuff like that. So It allows us to feel safe when we can just say people get the outcomes they deserve. The same also applies to wealth, right? So when you're rich, a lot of people think they deserve to be rich, right? And the poor people deserve to be poor because they don't work hard enough. So, for example, Trump saying like, "Oh, everyone could be as successful as me. I did it myself. All I had was a small loan of $1 million." Yeah, small loan of $1 million, right? I think we can all be successful if we can all just get a small loan of $1 million. Like that's really easy, right? Because how stock works and all that stuff, you can make a lot of money if you already have money. Um, so that's kind of like keeping the world in balance. So a bunch of stuff we could keep going on with the just world hypothesis, but it's weird. It keeps the world in order, but it's this really negative idea when you really break it down. So it comes down to, do you think the world is fair? And a lot of people will say it's fair, but not really. All right, moving on. Raise my hands. So first, impressions, primacy effects. So basically, the first time you see someone, the impression lasts longer than you would think. So it's really important that you make a good first impression. So when you like go to a job interview or something like that, it's better to overdress than underdress, because at least they're like, oh yeah, that person was professional, and that image of professionalism sticks with you longer than if you came there and you were like really casual. So first impressions matter. Right. Types of social identities. So I usually do another thing called a social identity wheel that basically talks about like different aspects of yourself. And we can identify ourselves in different groups so many different ways. So as it mentions at the bottom here, you have your ethnicity, your religion, your relationships, your job, your hobbies, your political affiliation, and then maybe even some more stigmatized identities, right? So thinking about all this different types of social identity, when we activate a social identity, we follow certain social roles and social scripts about that identity. For example, when we think of religion, right? So when you think about your religion, you may think about like your priest or pastor and kind of judgments they make on you, or God, or whatever it is you believe in. That may influence your behavior at a given time. For example, when people think about their religion, they're more likely to be charitable. Isn't that interesting, right? So you think about being a good person, religion primes you to be more charitable and to give more. Relationships. So, you can think of yourselves as a son or a daughter when you're with your parents, and you act in a certain way when you're with your parents, right? You maybe act more immature with your parents than when you're with your friends, because then you think of yourself as a friend, or with your partner, right? So when you're with your partner, you may take on a different role. You may take on a different role when you become a parent. So when you start having your first kid, you just kind of, just turn into a mother, father, and then you think of yourself differently. Like now you have someone to care for, and so forth. Life changes a lot when you have a kid. Vocation, so your job, for example, can cause you to act differently. For example, if you are a healthcare worker right now, right? Basically, you put on that hat and you have to think about differently. You may become more brave. You may become more careful when you put on that hat, like I gotta save people, versus like when you're out in the street by yourself. You may not, the nurse hat may not come on, or the medical assistant hat, and so forth. Like the professor hat, like I put that on when I have to teach and stuff. I become more extroverted. I ask more questions. But if I don't have that hat on, I'm just kind of more introverted, hanging out, kind of thing. So they said military veterans. So for some of you guys who are veterans, that can get activated in like an emergency situation. They're calling in like the reserves and stuff. So that can affect you. Hobbies as well. So if you have any hobbies, or if you're an athlete, Sometimes that gets tapped in. So usually you're a student in class, unless the athlete hat comes on, someone starts talking about the game that you played recently, and you kind of switch over when those identities are active. We'll skip political affiliation. We all know how that goes. Stigmatized identities, being overweight, being homeless. Most of us don't know if you're homeless or not. And school is almost like an escape from that. And same thing about being home in your environments right now. I don't know how that's going. But sometimes school allows you to escape from that and take on the identity of like being a student, and that's kind of a thing we take for granted too, like being a student and just focusing on learning and interacting, and getting your degree. All right, so that's a lot of social identities. Anything I'm missing? Social role, social scripts. Yep. Oh, social scripts. My name is shown on the PowerPoint window. Okay. Okay. Oh, I don't know. Okay. Lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. Social scripts can include if you're working in like the service industry, how you might interact with people you see and stuff like that. So it's just like saying hi as a cashier or how's your day kind of thing. Those are like social scripts you play when you're a cashier, but when you may be going around in the neighborhood again, you might not be that friendly to your neighbors. All right, so how are we on slides? We got 10 out of 50, so we'll keep going on for like another 30 minutes or so. So attitudes and behavior. So we know what our attitudes are, and attitudes don't always predict our behavior. So sometimes we have attitudes that we don't tell other people about or express as much. So it depends on how strong your attitudes are towards that. I think that's real altruism. I think we do get into that later. Yeah, one of the things. I believe in the idea of reciprocal altruism. So that's like you always get something back when you're being helpful. That's what most social psychologists believe in, the idea of reciprocal altruism. Even giving away free money to people, you do get that good feeling from doing that. So the only true altruism, I think, is like self-sacrifice. So that's like the ultimate, act, right, of altruism, self-sacrifice, and there's no return to you at all from that act of altruism. So that's the only one I think is like true altruism. But other than that, you get some type of return where you think it's like giving out karma and receiving good karma later. So, right. So, yeah, attitudes. What are your attitudes regarding global warming? I usually ask the class, like, do you guys believe in global warming? Hopefully you all do because it's real, right? Or not global warming, but climate change might be a more flexible term because people kind of downplay global warming because they're like some places are getting cold and more cold and some places are getting warmer. So climate change, right? So most of us do believe in climate change / global warming, but do we do anything about it? Most of us recycle at least, right? So if you recycle, you think, well, I'm contributing to reducing global warming because I'm recycling. But what's other ways you could do reduce global warming? Like how far would you go to reduce that? Are you becoming an activist? Are you reducing your carbon footprint? Are you trying to reduce everything? Because not everything we put in recycling gets recycled, right? So now we know that, like for example, China was accepting a lot of our recycled goods and a lot of the world's recycled goods, but that's not happening anymore. So recycle is piling up. Things that need to be recycled are piling up because it costs more to recycle things than to make new stuff. So that's an issue. So yeah, most of us put like cans and bottles in the recycled bin, even at school. How far would you go to do that though? If you saw another student throw a can or bottle in the non-recycling bin, do you take that out and put it in the recycling bin? Yeah, so that's a attitude behavior, right? So you're really invested in reducing climate change, global warming, then you would, take the can out and put it in the recycling area. But if you're not that invested, you're like, well, that person, you just do that just word hypothesis thing, right? You're just like, man, that person's just a bad person. It's so easy to recycle. I don't know why they don't do it. It's also so easy for you to go there and take the can out of the trash can and put it in the recycle bin, right? But most of us think germs and all that, and we don't want to do it kind of thing. All right. Right, so when our behaviors don't match our attitudes, we have what we call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is that discomfort you feel when you're inconsistent. So you may try to find ways. Sometimes I go to a trash bin and throw my trash right in front of it, but only if someone watch me. Like recycle? Okay. So yeah, watches. So effort justification. Effort justification is when we rationalize the amount of effort we put into something. So we'll talk more about that. But basically, it's the idea that whatever you put into it, the more you value it. So that's why your parents are like, hey, you gotta work for your first car or something like that. My parents didn't make me work for my first car, so I didn't value it. But if your parents did, if they're like, hey, if you work for half of it, I'll put in the other half, then you value that item that you bought with your own money more than if they just give you the item, right? Self-perception theory says we make inferences about our attitudes by perceiving our behavior. So when you find yourself doing something often, you start to think maybe you like it. So you find yourself playing a video game often, then you may be like, maybe I actually like this video game. So if you find yourself hanging out with someone often, then you are more likely to think like, well, maybe I must like this person, or maybe they're friendly, or maybe whatever, right? Because you're just seeing yourself hanging out with them more often. If you go to a class more often, right? Attendance, for example, when we used to have that thing. So when you are attending class more, you find yourself in the class, then you start to think, hey, maybe I like psychology because I'm always in class. The opposite is true too if you don't go to class. So if you don't go to class, you find yourself always skipping out on a certain class, psychology or whatever. Then you may find yourself, maybe I don't like this subject. That's why I'm always skipping out on class. And it doesn't have to be because you're intentionally doing it. So maybe even if it's like not your fault that you're skipping out on class, it could feed back to your behavior. So maybe it was because you missed the bus, or maybe it's because your ride canceled, or you got to work, or whatever other reason, it can cause you to have this feedback mechanism that could be kind of negative, where you start to think, maybe I don't enjoy that subject because, I can find ways to motivate myself to, attend class, like get on the bus earlier or something. All right, so they had this study that showed cognitive dissonance. So they had this really boring task. I think one of the tasks was like coiling a string. So just wrapping a string on a spool, and then unwrapping the string, and then wrapping it again for like 30 minutes to an hour. So you're doing the same thing again, and undoing it and redoing it and undoing it and redoing it. They had tasks like that were really boring, just doing the same thing over and over again. So you're sitting there and you're like, this is really boring. Why did I sign up for this? And the real manipulation is afterwards, because we all can agree that if you keep, you must be really bored to put a string, long string on a spool and then unstring it, restring it, right? Very repetitive. So afterwards, the manipulation was like, hey, there's another person that's going to do the study after you. Can you tell them that it was a fun task? It's weird, right? So they said they liked the task. So of course, most people, when asked to do something, generally like, okay, fine, yeah, I'll go tell them. So they'll go tell that person, hey, you're gonna enjoy the task. It was kind of fun. You'll like it, and then they left. Now that creates cognitive dissonance, because you feel you just did something really boring and you knew it was boring, but you had to tell someone else that it was fun. So your behavior does not match your attitude. So you feel discomfort. So solution one You said you liked the task, and you actually reflect and say, you know what, it was kind of relaxing to do the same thing over and over again, and I didn't have to think much about it. It took my mind off things. So you change your belief, your cognition, to match your attitude. I mean, you change your attitude to match your behavior, right? The other thing is you can add a justification. Like, you lied, but you got paid a lot of money for it. So this idea that if we had to lie, and someone paid us money for it, we feel better about it. But if someone pays us very little money, for example, I don't know, if I told you, hey, can you go tell this random group of students that psychology is really fun? And most of you guys like psychology, so you wouldn't mind. But for example, if you didn't like psychology, but you went and told a bunch of students that you did like psychology, you're more likely to feel better if I said I gave you $20 to do that versus I gave you $1. So if I gave you $1 to lie to a bunch of people, you may actually change your attitude. Because you're like, well, you know, is my trustworthiness only worth $1? No way, right? So I actually do like psychology, so I'm not lying when I told all these other students that I like psychology. Yeah, but if I gave you $20, then you're less likely to like psychology because you're like, well, you know, I lied for $20. It's okay, right? So can we catch ourselves in cognitive dissonance? Most of us do this really fast, really automatically. So it's kind of hard to really think and be like, oh man, I did that because I was experiencing cognitive dissonance. So it's more like retrospective that we think about why we did something, a behavior that didn't match our attitude, right? So we don't do hazing at OCC, right? But unless you're in like the military, maybe. But hazing came from like the military, and if you know anyone that's in the military, they generally like the military a lot, and they generally like their platoon a lot. They may even like the person who hazed them, like the officers and stuff like that. The idea is that hazing, because you put in a lot of effort for it, actually make you like the task more or the activity more. So that's why hazing is applied in fraternities and sororities, because you go through a lot of things to join the fraternity and sorority, so then you value your membership in the fraternity and sorority. So the effort is justified, right? So they make you do all these weird things, and so therefore you value it more. Membership fees are one way that's basically like this too. You're more likely to go to something if you had to pay a membership fee for it versus if it was free. Like if you were to join a club and they asked you for like $5 to join the club, you're more likely to utilize the club more versus if it was free for you to join the club. So they did another study, again, this other bar right here, relative magnitude of liking a group. So basically, if you had to do something to join a group, if it was none, you didn't like the group as much. If it was easy, just talk about yourself, introduce yourself, and we'll allow you to join the group. Versus, tell us a really embarrassing moment about yourself, then we'll let you join the group. So then that's a more difficult one. And because you did that, you're more likely to value the group, more likely to think the group was worthwhile, or the conversation was worthwhile. So persuasion is trying to change someone's attitude. So basically what I feel of education is persuasion, right? I'm basically trying to persuade you to like psychology and to learn about psychology. And I think that's what most professors generally do. They try to persuade you to some indoctrination of the subject matter that they teach. So some do it better than others, right? So elements include the communicator, so the source. What kind of basically qualifications does your professor have to teach you, right? Yeah, I'm getting a little rusty. I haven't talked this long in like weeks. So your professors' qualifications, whether like if they just graduated high school and they're teaching college, you probably wouldn't really trust them, right? Versus if they had like a master's degree or a doctorate degree, you're more likely to think that the person has the qualified training, or how long they've been teaching could also be a qualified training, or where they taught, right? If I was to say like, I don't know, I taught at Harvard or Stanford or one of the Ivy Leagues, and now I'm here at OCC, you're probably like, okay, he's very qualified, but why is he here, kind of thing, right? The medium, how the message is being presented, so online versus in person versus whatever form. The target, who the message is intended for, so I would speak differently if I was speaking to my colleagues about psychology versus if I'm teaching to students, or even like on the internet. So if this was like meant for anybody to see all across the internet, I might present myself differently versus to you guys, because I've seen you guys in person mostly. And what the message is. So the elaboration likelihood model basically says we interpret a persuasive message through two different ways. The central route is when we actually are motivated and we actually analyze it. The processing, we process it with a lot of effort. We actually think about the message. And persuasion, if we are convinced, there's a lasting change in attitude. So the idea is that through most of your education, you're supposed to use the central route. You're motivated to learn about your class, you analyze the content, you participate in discussion boards and all that stuff with a lot of effort, and you actually change about your opinions regarding that subject matter. So the idea is hopefully psychology teaches you all kinds of things. Are you done with your video? Okay, go hang out with Mama. Want to say hi? No?
Hi.
They can see you.
Hi.
Okay, now go hang out with Mama. Take yourself and go play scary teacher. Right, the other route is the peripheral route. That's when we're not really motivated, so just kind of going through the class kind of thing. Like if it's a subject you don't really care about, you may be not motivated to do it. There's less effort involved, and there's a temporary change in attitude. So you may have a course where you're just like, oh yeah, I'll adopt whatever the professor is saying for that course, and there's not really a lasting change in your attitude. So it's kind of like if you accept what I talk about in psychology, and then once you're done with that, you dump it and go back to however you were before the lesson. I'm gonna go close the door.
I start to tell me.
Go talk to Mama. All right. Dun, 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 dun. Right. So more on persuasion. Informational influence is a type of persuasion. Basically, it's when other people basically influence your behaviors, right? So standing in line is something that you get influenced by. So if other people are social distancing, you will also do that. If other people are just all up in each other's faces, hopefully you also don't listen to them, because that's not really good information to do. So when I was in the club scene back in like LA and all that stuff, there's lots of clubs in LA and night scenes and all that. Even in Vegas, all the clubs always have people waiting in line. So you're like, oh man, that club looks like it's really fun. There's tons of people outside waiting. And they do this on purpose. What does informational influence? Yeah, that up to 6, I think, is what most people are influenced by. So if you have bigger and bigger groups, the influence level drops down. But around 6 is really influential. So if there were 6 people looking up in the sky, at whatever and act like they're looking at something in the sky, people are gonna look where they're looking. So they're like, why are you guys all looking up there? And everyone just kind of looks too. But if you have more and more people, then it starts to decrease the power of convincing drops. Yeah, they've done studies. Right, so let's see. Systematic persuasion is just another name for the first one, the controlled persuasive central route. Heuristic persuasion is the peripheral one. Okay, looks like I'm not going to be able to go that much longer since I haven't spoken that long. So here's a study they did on the persuasion, right? So in this first box, we have students who were highly motivated. So I think it was something like tuition increases. And in the highly motivated group, was it tuition increases? It's either tuition increases or it was a eval, like a qualifications. Qualifications. Basically a exit test. So it was either they were going to raise tuition or you had to pass a test to graduate. Both things students don't really want to do. In the highly motivated group, it was students were told that it was going to come into effect that semester before they graduated. So it was a policy change and it was going to affect them. So they were highly motivated to think about what the arguments for and against the policy was. So here's, in the first group, they were told, in one group, they were told that it was from a Princeton professor. So it was like, hey, this is a Princeton professor, and he's arguing why we should like raise tuition. So they agreed with really most of the arguments and disagreed with some of the other arguments, right? But he sounded convincing. In another group, they were told it was from a high school student. So the agreement was still the same. So like good arguments about why we should raise tuition, it funds this, it funds that, blah, blah, blah. They agreed with it, but they were more likely to disagree. So you can see how they had more confidence in disagreeing with statements when they knew it wasn't from like a highly reliable source, right? And then in the low motivation group, they were told like this policy was going to affect you after you graduate. So with the low motivation group, they only cared about the source. So the Princeton professor being an expert, they're like, yeah, he sounds right. And he agreed with both. They didn't agree strongly, but they were like, hey, he sounds right most of the time. And they didn't disagree with anything. They was like, okay, all these arguments sound valid. When they were told it was from a high school student, they disagreed with everything. So that's the peripheral route, where they're just like, the source matters, right? Who do you listen to matters. Now again, I can't help but get political about our coronavirus response and all that stuff. That can play a role too. Like most people are not very highly motivated to care about the coronavirus and all that stuff and the expert news source and so forth. So what that leads to is a lot of low motivation, a lot of peripheral route about who should you trust and what kind of messages should you trust from people, right? So either you trust the experts, healthcare workers, and all that stuff, doctors, researchers, scientists, and all that, or you trust whoever you trust, like your local newscaster or Trump, for example. With the low motivation, people just kind of like, okay, whatever the president says is true. Or they take the expert side. Whatever the expert says is true, and we're going to disregard whatever the president says because he says a bunch of crazy stuff all the time. So, low motivation. Yes, the responses are different because people trust who they want to trust, and they're not actually reading through all the research and stuff like that. Even there's so many mixed messages right now, right? So American, I guess most of the world thinks it's China. China thinks it's America, but like it's from the Americans, and it's kind of interesting because my wife was like, "Hey, maybe the Chinese are right." She's Chinese because America has more cases than China. I'm like, you really believe that? I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. We do have more cases, but I think it's just because we didn't contain it at all. So it just kind of spread, and and how the airlines basically kind of promoted traveling, right? Everyone were joking in class about like, it's really cheap to travel right now. Yeah, that probably caused a lot more infections instead of them just testing people. So yeah, I think some states still don't have a stay home measure. because yeah, Trump's really not gonna put down a federal order to everyone stay home. So some states it's like business as usual. New York is pretty shut down. So it's California. I heard California has less cases because they quarantined earlier than we did, or started to stay home earlier than we did. So. All right. Yeah. So that's probably where I'll stop. Yeah, I'll go through some of this a little bit. Yeah, we'll stop at social influence. So I'll cover this one. These are just ways to persuade you. Foot in the door, a small request followed by a big one. So you know, would you like to try a sample would work, right? So after you try a sample and they're like, how is it? And you're like, it's good. And then they're like, would you like to buy it? And there will be some people who feel guilty because you just told them that you said it was good, right? And then you're more likely to buy it. So I've seen this at Costco because Costco gives out snacks and stuff, samples, and they'll take the sample, they'll take the product right after trying the sample, and it'll end up like in an aisle over. So they're like feeling guilty, and some people have a hard time saying no. So they'll take the item and then like go an aisle later and then put it back down because they actually didn't want to buy it. It's like just foot in the door technique. Small request followed by a big one. So you're more likely to keep doing the request if say someone asks you and you said yes in the first place. So it's like if someone was carrying a bunch of groceries and they had a bunch of groceries on the ground and they had some in their hand and they asked you, hey, can you shut the door for me? And you're like, oh yeah, sure. And so you shut the car door and they're like, hey, can you help me bring some stuff up? And you're more likely to say yes because you just said yes to shutting the door. So the door in the face technique is a big request followed by a small one. I wish I still had a job to go. I was saying home is the worst. Oh yeah. Yeah, so the door in the face is the expectation that you're gonna get a no on the first response. Would you like to donate $50? Most people are like no, like I'm not gonna give you $50, right? How about a few bucks? Any bit helps. Even some loose change. Now they just got some loose change from you, see? Yeah. So door in the face technique. So if you want to use these techniques, either ask your parents for like $1 or $5 and then ask them for a little bit more. So foot in the door, hey, can I have $5 for some snacks, and then ask them for like, hey, can I have $10 for gas, or can I have $20 for the movies? You kind of increase the amount, so then you end up getting the higher amount that you wanted. The door in the face technique, these techniques really work. Ask for a lot. Ask your parents for like, hey, can I have $100? And they're like, hell no, why would I give you $100? And you're like, okay, can I have $20? And then they're like, okay, yeah, because they're thinking like they got away with giving you $20 instead of $100. So getting away scot-free kind of thing. So the door in the face, you can be inoculated to now that you know about these versions, these ways that people can try to get you, then you're more resistant to it in the future. Alright, so that's where I'll stop for today. We'll just hang out a little bit. You guys are having conversations, chat, so that's good. Yeah, but my voice, I think my throat is getting scratchy for not going on that long. So hopefully we'll have more people watching this. 12 views is already an improvement from last time. So I'll see you guys on Wednesday, same time. And I think the chat still goes on if I stop streaming, but I'm worried about that. Let's ask Josh. Oh, cool. Joshua is a streamer.